They shoved me against my own kitchen counter. My daughter's husband and a man in a dark suit who claimed to be a lawyer. The impact knocked my teacup to the floor, porcelain fragments scattering across the blue linoleum like broken promises. My name is Helen Marlowe. I'm 71 years old, and the two men standing in my Charleston kitchen just tried to force me to sign away everything my late husband Richard built with his calloused hands over 4 decades of construction work. What they don't know is that Richard left me more than they could ever imagine. 23 beachfront villas stretching from Myrtle Beach to Hilton Head, worth exactly $293,047.63. Properties that have weathered hurricanes and economic storms, built to last generations. They think I'm just a confused old woman living on a teacher's pension. If you believe in quiet strength over loud desperation, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like mine reach other women who need to hear them. But let me tell you how I discovered their real plan and why my husband's final words saved everything. It started at my daughter Lydia's wedding reception 3 weeks ago. Charleston's historic ballroom, all crystal chandeliers and mahogany floors. The photographer arranged the family portraits, but somehow I ended up at table 14, tucked behind a towering arrangement of white orchids near the service exit. Not an accident. Families don't make mistakes like that. I sat quietly in my navy dress with the pearl brooch Richard gave me for our 40th anniversary. I smiled when others smiled, raised my glass when toasts were offered, clapped when tradition demanded. Inside, something cracked. This was my daughter's wedding, yet I was positioned like an afterthought, barely visible in the photographs that would later fill albums and social media feeds. Lydia looked radiant in her gown, laughing at something Ethan whispered in her ear. My new son-in-law, 28 years old, with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. He worked in his mother's real estate development company, drove a leased BMW, wore Italian suits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. During the reception, I overheard fragments of conversation. Ethan's voice carried across the room as he spoke to his mother, Patricia, near the bar. Once the honeymoon's over, we'll handle the Helen situation. She's living alone in that house, confused about finances. Someone needs to step in before she makes poor decisions. The Helen situation. As if I were a problem to be solved, rather than the mother who had raised his wife, taught elementary school for 37 years, graded thousands of papers by lamplight, while Richard worked construction jobs that built the foundation of everything we owned. That night, I drove home to my modest 2-story house, painted the pale blue Richard once called sea glass. The shutters are white, though the paint has begun peeling at the edges. In my small garden, roses climb the cedar trellis Richard built with leftover lumber from a job site. Even after the worst storms, they return each spring with a fragrance that reminds me of promises kept. Inside, everything has its place. The kettle sits on the stove, polished from decades of use. Teacups hang in neat rows above the sink. In the hallway stands Richard's old, safe scuffed metal that moved with us through 5 different houses before we settled here. That safe contains more than documents. It holds our entire history. The brass key to that safe stays in my cardigan pocket always. Heavy for its size, warm from my body heat. When I'm nervous, I close my hand around it, like holding Richard's palm again. It's not just metal, it's reassurance that some things cannot be taken. Richard was a builder in every sense. He started with deck repairs and roof replacements before moving to larger coastal projects. His vision was creating homes that stood against wind and salt, places where families could gather without fear of the next storm. Wind and salt are the true test of any wall, he'd say, running his hand along freshly installed beams. Over 23 years, he constructed a chain of beachfront villas, each one solid and tested by hurricanes. He called them the houses of wind and salt, and loved them like children born from his labor. When he became sick, the work slowed, but his mind remained sharp. I remember the night he placed the trust documents in the safe. His face was pale breath, shallow, but his eyes held the same determination I'd seen on scaffolding 30 years earlier. Helen. He gripped my hand until I felt his pulse in my palm. Promise me this. Don't tell anyone what I've left you. Don't sign anything. Not a single page. Not until you have to. These villas aren't just money. They're proof of what we built together. I nodded through tears, thinking he was being overly cautious. Lydia had always been close to me. I believed she would never let anyone treat me with anything but respect. Richard must have sensed something I didn't. A week after the wedding, I heard a knock on my front door. I opened it to find Ethan standing there in a pressed white shirt, smile too polished to be genuine. Beside him stood the stranger in the dark suit carrying a briefcase. Mother, Ethan began, the words sliding off his tongue like oil on water. We thought we'd stop by to help with some important paperwork, just to make sure you're safe now that you're living alone. They followed me into the kitchen. I placed my teacup on the table, steam curling upward. The lawyer slid a thick folder across the wood. Bold, black letters on the cover, durable power of attorney. Ethan rested his hand lightly on the folder. It's just a formality. Lydia and I want to make sure you're cared for, that nothing goes wrong with the bank accounts, the properties, everything your husband left behind. My spoon slipped against the cup with a soft, metallic chime. That small sound told me everything. They weren't here to protect me. They were here to strip away what Richard had worked his entire life to preserve. I looked at the folder. I looked at Ethan's expectant face. I said nothing. That's when they pushed me against the counter, the lawyer grabbing my wrist, while Ethan hissed, "Sign it, Helen. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Silence became my armor in that moment, and that's where the real story begins. I wrenched my arm free and stepped back, the brass key digging into my palm through the cardigan fabric. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Ethan's mask slipped completely. "Listen, you old bat. My company owes $347,000 to creditors. The bank's breathing down our necks. These properties are sitting here doing nothing while you play house in this dump. Sign the papers, or we'll have you declared incompetent." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. A hired gun, not a real attorney. I walked to the phone on the kitchen counter and dialed 911. "This is Helen Marlowe at 47 Seaview Drive. 2 men forced their way into my home and are trying to coerce me into signing legal documents." They were gone before the police arrived, leaving only the broken teacup and the folder of lies on my table. Officer Martinez took my statement, photographed the shattered porcelain, and advised me to contact an attorney immediately. After he left, I sat in the quiet kitchen, hands shaking as I brewed fresh tea. The next morning, I called James O'Connor, Richard's longtime attorney. His office occupied a converted brick townhouse near the courthouse, rumpled but reliable. He'd handled every property deed, every construction contract, every piece of Richard's business for 25 years. "Helen," his voice was warm but concerned, I've been expecting your call. Richard made me promise that if your name ever came up on my voicemail, I'd drop everything. Within an hour, James sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the documents that Ethan had left behind. He flipped through pages, shaking his head. Durable power of attorney, with broad language, immediate effect, no safeguards. This would give them access to everything without condition. My stomach churned. Richard told me not to sign anything. He said I'd understand one day. James leaned forward, his glasses catching the afternoon light. He was protecting you from exactly this scenario. The trust he established isn't just legal paperwork, Helen. It's a fortress. Every property is held in an irrevocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary and trustee. No one can touch it without your explicit consent and judicial oversight. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by anger. They knew I was vulnerable. They counted on me being confused and alone. Predators always do. James opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of forms. We're going to reinforce every legal barrier Richard put in place. First, we'll re-record all deeds at the county office to refresh the chain of title. Then, we'll freeze your credit with all 3 bureaus so no one can open accounts in your name. Over the next 3 hours, I signed document after document. Each signature felt like laying another brick in Richard's wall of protection. James notarized every page, the red seal hitting the paper with a decisive thud that echoed through the kitchen. We'll also establish a healthcare directive naming your neighbor Margaret as primary proxy, not Lydia, James explained. And we'll set up banking protocols requiring your personal signature verification for any transactions over $500. By late afternoon, my kitchen table was covered with stamped papers, forming a new architecture of safety. James gathered them carefully, sliding them into his briefcase like pieces of armor. By this time, next week, no one will be able to touch a penny without going through proper legal channels, he promised. That evening, I walked through my house, seeing it differently. Not as a modest retirement home, but as the center of a financial empire Richard had built beam by beam, contract by contract. The villas weren't just properties. They were his love letters to me, each one a promise that I would never want for anything. I opened the safe and pulled out the trust documents, reading them for the first time with clear eyes. Richard had anticipated everything. Monthly income distributions from rental properties, maintenance reserves, property management companies already in place, tax preparations handled by the same firm for 15 years. I wasn't just a widow living on Social Security and a teacher's pension. I was the sole owner of $47 million in prime coastal real estate, generating over $2 million annually in rental income that had been quietly depositing into accounts I barely monitored. The phone rang, startling me from my revelation. Lydia's name appeared on the caller ID. Mom, Ethan told me what happened yesterday. I'm so sorry. He was just worried about your safety, trying to help organize your affairs. I listened to her rehearsed words, hearing the coaching behind them. Lydia, did you know about your father's properties? The full extent of what he left. Silence stretched across the line. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. Ethan said there were some rental houses. He said they needed professional management before they became a burden. 23 beachfront villas, sweetheart, worth nearly $50 million, all held in an irrevocable trust with me as the sole beneficiary. Your father built an empire, and your husband tried to steal it. I heard her sharp intake of breath. That's impossible. You live in a tiny house. You drive a 15-year-old Honda. You clip grocery coupons. Because that's how your father and I lived our entire marriage. We put every dollar back into the business into building something permanent. The trust provides more income than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Another long pause. Then, Mom, if that's true, why didn't you ever tell me? Because Richard warned me not to. He said money changes people, brings out their worst instincts. He was right, wasn't he? Lydia's voice cracked. I didn't know, Mom. I swear I didn't know Ethan was lying about the amounts. But his company really is in trouble. His mother's been pressuring both of us to find a solution. So the solution was to rob your mother. No, it wasn't supposed to be robbery. Ethan said you needed help managing everything, that it would be better if someone younger handled the business side while you enjoyed retirement, while he used my assets as collateral for his failed investments. I heard muffled voices in the background. Ethan's angry tone cutting through. Lydia's voice returned, strained. Mom, I need to think about this. I need to understand what's real and what I've been told. Think carefully, Lydia. 27 years of marriage taught me that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. After she hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk, the trust documents spread across my lap. Richard had known this day would come. Not the specific details, but the pattern. Money attracts predators, even when they wear familiar faces. I touched the brass key, still warm in my pocket, and whispered to the empty room. You built more than houses, didn't you, Richard? You built a test. The next morning brought a certified letter from Patricia Morrison, Ethan's mother and president of Morrison Development Group. The letterhead was embossed, official-looking, designed to intimidate. Dear Mrs. Marlowe, it began, our family attorney has advised us that certain property transfers executed by your late husband may have been done without proper disclosure to beneficiaries. We are requesting an immediate audit of all assets to ensure compliance with South Carolina inheritance law. I read it twice, then called James. Legal harassment, he said, after I read the letter aloud. They're fishing, hoping you'll panic and make mistakes. Ignore it completely. If they had any legitimate claim, they'd file in court, not send threatening letters. That afternoon, I drove to Morrison Development Group's offices in a gleaming downtown tower. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and a nervous smile, directed me to the executive floor. Patricia Morrison was exactly what I expected. 65 years old, with chemically blonde hair, jewelry that cost more than most people's cars, and the predatory confidence of someone who'd spent decades taking what didn't belong to her. Helen, she said, not rising from behind her marble desk, I'm surprised to see you here. I wanted to discuss your letter in person. I sat down, uninvited, folding my hands in my lap. The one where you threatened to audit my husband's estate. Her smile was sharp as broken glass. Not a threat, dear. A legal necessity. Ethan is family now, which gives him certain rights regarding Lydia's inheritance. Lydia's inheritance comes from me when I die, not from her father's estate. The trust is irrevocable and clearly documented. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Trusts can be challenged, especially when there are questions about the mental capacity of the person who established them. Richard was quite ill toward the end, wasn't he? My hands tightened in my lap, but my voice remained steady. Richard's medical records are sealed. His attorneys will testify to his mental competency. And I have 40 years of witnesses to his business acumen. We'll see about that. Patricia leaned back in her leather chair. You're an old woman living alone, Helen. Accidents happen. Memory fails. It would be so much easier for everyone if you simply allowed proper management of these assets. The threat hung in the air between us, unveiled and ugly. I stood slowly smoothing my skirt. Patricia, I taught 5th grade for 37 years. I've seen bullies before, They're usually cowards underneath all the noise. Her face flushed red. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Actually, I do. I'm dealing with a woman whose son married my daughter for money that doesn't exist, whose business is failing, and who thinks an elderly widow will be easy prey. I walked toward the door, then turned back. Tell Ethan he has 48 hours to return the key he stole from my kitchen yesterday. After that, I'm filing a police report for breaking and entering. I left her sputtering behind me, rode the elevator down in silence, and walked out into the Charleston sunshine, feeling stronger than I had in months. Richard had been right. This wasn't just about money. It was about character, about the kind of person you become when you think no one is watching. The fortress was holding. 3 days later, I discovered just how far they were willing to go. Margaret Chen, my neighbor, 2 houses down, knocked on my door at 7 in the morning. She stood on my porch, holding a manila envelope. Her usual composed demeanor cracked with worry. Helen, you need to see this. She stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind her. My grandson Tommy works part-time at the courthouse filing office. He recognized your name on some documents. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were photocopies of official papers bearing the Charleston County seal, a petition for guardianship filed by Ethan Morrison, citing my increasing mental confusion and inability to manage financial affairs. The supporting documents made my blood freeze. A sworn affidavit from Dr. Patricia Chen, claiming I'd missed 3 consecutive appointments and displayed signs of dementia during my last visit. Medical records allegedly showing prescribed medications for cognitive decline. A statement from a home health aide named Jessica Martinez, reporting concerning behaviors during routine welfare checks. Every single document was fabricated. I've never seen Dr. Patricia Chen in my life, I said, my voice hollow. And there's no Jessica Martinez. But the letterhead looks real. The seals look authentic. Margaret sat beside me at the kitchen table, her jaw tight with anger. This is fraud, Helen. They're trying to have you declared mentally incompetent so they can seize control of your assets. Tommy says a hearing is scheduled for next week. I called James immediately. His secretary put me through despite his busy morning schedule. They're moving fast, he said after I read him the documents. This is a coordinated attack designed to catch us off guard, but they made one critical mistake. What's that? They filed in the wrong jurisdiction. Your assets are held in trust in Beaufort County, not Charleston. This petition has no legal standing, but we still need to respond aggressively. Within hours, James had assembled a team. His associate, Sarah Williams, specialized in elder law and guardianship challenges. Private investigator Marcus Webb began documenting the fraudulent medical records. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, my actual physician for 12 years, prepared a comprehensive cognitive assessment. We're not just defending, James explained during our emergency meeting. We're going on offense. Filing false documents is a felony. Conspiracy to defraud a vulnerable adult carries serious penalties. That evening, Lydia called, her voice strained and distant. Mom, I just got a call from Dr. Chen's office. They said you missed important appointments and that your memory has been getting worse. Is that true? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deeper into my chest. Lydia, I've never heard of Dr. Chen before yesterday. Those medical records are completely fabricated. But why would anyone fake medical records? That doesn't make sense. Ask your husband. He filed a guardianship petition using those fake documents as evidence. Silence stretched across the phone line. When Lydia spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. What are you talking about? I explained everything. The forged medical records, the fraudulent petition, the conspiracy to have me declared mentally incompetent. Lydia listened without interrupting, her breathing growing heavier with each revelation. "This can't be true," she finally said. "Ethan he couldn't. Call the courthouse yourself. Ask for case number 2024 CV1847. Read the documents they filed." Another long pause. "Mom, I need to see you. Can I come over tonight?" "Of course, sweetheart." 2 hours later, Lydia sat in my kitchen, looking like a woman who'd aged a decade in a single day. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her hands shook as she held the photocopied documents. "I confronted Ethan," she said, her voice hollow. "He tried to convince me it was for your own protection, that you really were getting confused and needed professional care. But when I pressed him about the fake medical records, he broke down." She wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "He admitted everything. The gambling debts, the business loans secured against properties he doesn't own, his mother's plan to gain control of your assets through guardianship. How much does he owe? Over $400,000 to various creditors. His mother borrowed against their business properties to cover the initial losses. But that money's gone too. They're facing bankruptcy within 60 days. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "I'm sorry, Lydia. I know this isn't the man you thought you married." She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. "He said if the plan worked, we'd pay back everything and still have enough left over to start fresh somewhere else. He made it sound like borrowing, not stealing. Did you believe him?" Lydia's laugh was bitter and broken. "I wanted to. I wanted to believe my husband was a good man who'd made bad choices, not a criminal who married me to get access to money he thought you had." We sat in silence as the kitchen clock ticked away the minutes. Finally, Lydia looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Mom, I need you to know something. I never wanted to hurt you. When Ethan first suggested helping manage your finances, I thought it was genuine concern. I thought we were protecting you. I know, sweetheart, but I should have asked more questions. I should have insisted on transparency. I should have trusted my instincts when things felt wrong." She straightened in her chair, some of her old strength returning. "What can I do to help fix this? You can testify at the hearing. Tell the judge exactly what Ethan admitted to you. Help James prove this was a conspiracy." Lydia nodded firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes. But Mom, what happens after this? To my marriage? To my life?" I looked at my daughter, seeing both the little girl who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms and the strong woman she was becoming. "That's your choice to make. But remember what your father used to say about building foundations. If the ground isn't solid, nothing built on top of it will last." The hearing took place the following Tuesday in Charleston County Family Court. Judge Sarah Richardson presided, a stern woman in her 50s with a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. Ethan and Patricia sat with their attorney, a slick-haired man in an expensive suit who kept checking his Rolex. They'd expected an easy victory against a confused elderly woman with no legal representation. Instead, they faced James O'Connor's legal team, armed with evidence of fraud and conspiracy. Dr. Elizabeth Harper testified, first reading from my complete medical file. Mrs. Marlowe shows no signs of cognitive decline. Her last comprehensive exam 3 months ago indicated excellent mental acuity for her age group. I've never referred her to Dr. Patricia Chen because Dr. Chen doesn't exist in our medical database. Marcus Webb presented his investigation results. The medical records submitted were created using a template downloaded from a legal document website. The letterhead for Dr. Chen's practice shows an address that houses a Subway sandwich shop. Jessica Martinez, the alleged home health aide is actually a stock photo model whose image was lifted from a healthcare website. Sarah Williams, James's associate, systematically dismantled each fraudulent document while I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, letting the evidence speak for itself. Then Lydia took the stand. She wore a simple navy dress and spoke in a clear, steady voice as she described Ethan's confession. The gambling addiction he'd hidden throughout their marriage. The business loans secured against assets he didn't own. His mother's plan to gain control of my estate through false guardianship. Your Honor, Lydia said, looking directly at the judge, I want the court to know that I was unaware of these activities and that I completely oppose any attempt to defraud my mother. She is mentally competent and capable of managing her own affairs. Ethan's attorney barely mounted a defense. How do you argue for guardianship when your own star witness has recanted and provided evidence of conspiracy? Judge Richardson didn't deliberate long. Not only is this petition dismissed, she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade, but I'm ordering the Charleston County District Attorney to investigate criminal charges against the petitioners. Filing false documents in my court is a serious felony. She turned to face Ethan and Patricia directly. You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't hold you in contempt right now. Their attorney requested an immediate recess. Within 15 minutes, he withdrew from the case, entirely leaving Ethan and Patricia to face the judge's wrath alone. Outside the courthouse, James shook my hand with satisfaction. They'll be lucky to avoid prison time. The DA's office takes elder fraud very seriously, especially when it involves forged medical records. Lydia walked beside me to the parking lot, her steps hesitant. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always. Do you forgive me for being part of this, even unknowingly? I stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Lydia, forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you accept. You made mistakes, but you corrected them when you learned the truth. That's what people with character do. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. What happens now between us, now we rebuild trust, the same way your father built those villas. One beam at a time, tested against every storm, until the foundation is solid enough to last. As we stood in the Charleston sunshine, I realized this battle wasn't just about money or property. It was about identity, about refusing to be diminished by other people's greed and desperation. Richard had built me a fortress, but I'd learned to defend it myself. The criminal charges came down like hammers. 2 weeks after the failed guardianship hearing, Detective Maria Santos from the Charleston County Sheriff's Department called to inform me that Ethan and Patricia Morrison faced multiple felony counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false documents, attempted theft from a vulnerable adult, identity theft for creating the fictitious Dr. Chen. The district attorney wants to meet with you, Detective Santos explained. Your case has become the centerpiece of a larger investigation into elder financial abuse. Apparently, the Morrisons tried this scheme before. I met with Assistant District Attorney Thomas Chen at the downtown courthouse. He was younger than I expected, probably early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that comes from genuine passion for justice. Mrs. Marlowe, we've discovered at least 3 other elderly victims who were approached by Morrison Development Group with similar power of attorney schemes. All widows, all with substantial but hidden assets, all targeted within months of their spouses' deaths. He slid a folder across his desk. Inside were photographs of 3 women I didn't recognize, along with police reports and financial statements showing losses totaling over $2 million. They perfected the technique, ADA, Chen continued. Ethan would research recent obituaries, identify widows with property assets, then manufacture family connections to gain access. Patricia handled the legal paperwork and fraudulent documentation. They called it estate optimization. My hands clenched in my lap. How many families did they destroy? At least 7 that we know of. But your case is different, Mrs. Marlowe. You fought back. You didn't sign. Your testimony and evidence will help convict them and potentially recover money for the other victims. The trial was set for October 6 months away. In the meantime, I had to live with the weight of knowing I wasn't their first target, just their first failure. The revelation changed something fundamental in how I viewed the whole ordeal. This wasn't about family dynamics or generational misunderstanding. This was about predators who had refined their techniques through practice on other grieving women. I called Margaret that evening, needing to share the burden of knowledge. I keep thinking about those other women, I told her as we sat on my porch with evening tea. How many of them signed because they trusted someone who called them mother? How many lost everything because they wanted to believe in family? Margaret's response was characteristically direct. You can't save the past, Helen, but you can prevent the future. That's why testimony matters. That's why refusing to stay quiet matters. She was right, but the weight of responsibility felt enormous. 7 families destroyed by a scheme that targeted the most vulnerable moment in a person's life. Fresh grief combined with financial confusion. Meanwhile, Lydia struggled with her own reckoning. She filed for divorce within a week of the criminal charges, but disentangling a life took more than paperwork. They'd shared a mortgage joint, credit cards, business investments. Ethan's legal troubles froze most of their assets, while investigators traced the money trail. I feel like I'm living in someone else's life, Lydia told me during one of our weekly dinners. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage was built on lies. Even our honeymoon was paid for with money he'd stolen from one of the other victims. She'd moved into a small apartment downtown, working as a substitute teacher while finishing her master's degree in education. The woman who'd once lived in a suburban mansion with marble countertops now clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. Are you ashamed of how I'm living now? She asked one evening, looking around her modest 1-bedroom apartment. I'm proud of you, I answered honestly. You're building something real for the first time in your adult life. That takes courage. The media attention began in August when the trial date was announced. Low Country widow fights back against family fraud, read the headline in the Charleston Post and Courier. Television news crews filmed B-roll footage of my modest house, contrasting it with images of the beachfront villas Richard had built. The story captured public attention because it represented every family's worst fear, being betrayed by the people closest to you during your most vulnerable moments. I received dozens of letters from other elderly women sharing similar experiences. Some had lost everything. Others had fought back successfully. All of them understood the particular cruelty of having family members weaponize trust and grief for financial gain. One letter came from Eleanor Whitman in Savannah, whose son-in-law had used similar tactics to steal her late husband's antique collection worth over $800,000. Reading about your case gave me courage to finally press charges, she wrote. I thought keeping quiet would preserve family relationships, but silence only protected the criminals. Another came from Ruth Martinez in Colombia, whose daughter had forged her signature on reverse mortgage documents that nearly cost her the family home. Your story reminded me that mothers can love their children without surrendering their dignity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable their worst choices. Each letter reinforced my understanding that this battle extended far beyond my kitchen table. Elder financial abuse had become epidemic precisely because it exploited the deepest human bonds during the most emotionally fragile periods of life. In September, James received an unexpected call from Patricia Morrison's attorney. "They want to plea bargain," he told me during our weekly meeting. Patricia would testify against Ethan in exchange for reduced charges. "They're also offering full restitution to all victims if we agree to recommend minimum sentences." I thought about the other women whose photos I'd seen in ADA Chen's office. Frances Wellington, age 73, who lost her family farm. Dorothy Blackwell, age 69, who signed over her retirement savings. Maria Santos, age 75, who forfeited the small business she'd built over 40 years. What would restitution mean for them? Full recovery of their losses, plus interest and penalties. We're talking about over $3 million total. That night, I called each of the other victims personally. The phone numbers were in the court file's public record now. Each conversation was heartbreaking and hopeful. Frances Wellington cried when I explained the plea deal. "I never thought I'd see that money again. I've been living with my sister for 2 years because I couldn't afford to keep the farm." Dorothy Blackwell was more cautious. "Are you sure this isn't another scam? Someone calling to ask for personal information?" "I understand your suspicion," I told her. "But you can verify everything through the district attorney's office. This is real, Dorothy. We're going to get your money back." By the end of the week, all victims had agreed to support the plea arrangement. Justice wouldn't erase the trauma, but financial recovery would restore some measure of security to lives that had been devastated. The plea hearing took place on a rainy Thursday morning in October. I sat in the front row of Charleston County Court, watching Patricia Morrison stand before Judge Richardson with tears streaming down her face. "Your Honor, I want to state publicly that I deeply regret my actions. Mrs. Marlowe and the other victims trusted us, and we violated that trust in the most despicable way. I take full responsibility for my role in these crimes." Ethan's plea came next. He looked nothing like the confident man who'd pushed me against my kitchen counter. Prison orange had replaced Italian suits. Shackles had replaced his Rolex. "I have no excuse for what I did," he said, his voice barely audible. "I let gambling addiction and financial desperation turn me into someone I don't recognize. I'm grateful that Mrs. Marlowe was strong enough to fight back because it stopped us from hurting more people." Judge Richardson sentenced Patricia to 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. Ethan received 3 years in prison and 7 years probation. Both would be required to make full restitution and perform 2,000 hours of community service specifically focused on elder abuse prevention. "I want this case to serve as a warning," Judge Richardson said before adjourning. "South Carolina will not tolerate predators who target our most vulnerable citizens. Elder abuse prosecution will be swift, severe, and certain." Outside the courthouse, the other victims waited for me. 7 women ranging in age from 67 to 83 who had survived a coordinated attack on their life savings and dignity. Frances Wellington hugged me tightly. "Thank you for fighting when the rest of us couldn't." "We all fought," I replied. "Some battles are just more visible than others." ADA. Chen shook my hand and presented me with a certificate recognizing my role in the investigation. "Mrs. Marlowe, your courage prevented additional victims and helped us recover over $3 million in stolen assets. The state of South Carolina is in your debt." Standing on those courthouse steps, surrounded by women who had survived the same attack I'd faced, I finally understood what Richard meant when he talked about building foundations that could withstand any storm. The fortress he'd built protected more than just my assets. It protected my ability to stand firm when others couldn't, to fight back, when resistance seemed impossible, to become the immovable object that stopped predators in their tracks. Justice wasn't just the legal verdicts or financial restitution. Justice was 7 women walking away from that courthouse, with their dignity restored, their faith in the system renewed, and their financial security guaranteed. The fortress had held, but more importantly, it had become a beacon for others who needed to know that fighting back was possible. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter that changed everything again. The envelope was cream-colored, paper-expensive stock, with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside, a single page written in careful script. Dear Mrs. Marlowe, my name is Patricia Morrison, Jr. I am Ethan's sister and Patricia's daughter. I know you have no reason to trust anyone in my family, but I'm writing to tell you something important about my father that my mother and brother never wanted you to know. If you're willing to listen, I'd like to meet with you. I have documents and photographs that explain why they targeted you specifically and why your husband was so careful about protecting his assets. I understand if you prefer not to meet. Our family has caused you enough pain, but I believe you deserve to know the whole truth. Sincerely, Patricia Morrison, Jr. Call me Patty. I stared at the letter for a long time, then called James. It could be another scam, he warned. Family members sometimes try to manipulate victims after criminals are convicted. What could she possibly know that changes anything now? I don't know, but something in the tone feels different, more genuine. If you decide to meet her, I insist on being present, and we meet in my office, not anywhere private. 3 days later, Patty Morrison sat across from James and me in his conference room. She was nothing like her mother and brother, mid-30s, conservatively dressed, with the tired look of someone carrying heavy secrets. Mrs. Marlowe, I need to start by apologizing for my family's actions. What they did was unforgivable. I testified for the prosecution because I believe in accountability, even for people I love. She opened a leather portfolio and spread documents across the table. These are my father's business records from 1987 through 1995. He was Robert Morrison, the contractor who worked with your husband Richard on several projects. They were partners, actually, not just business associates. I leaned forward, studying the papers. Construction contracts, bearing both Richard's and Robert Morrison's signatures. Partnership agreements for joint ventures. Bank records showing shared profits and expenses. I don't understand. Richard never mentioned a business partner named Morrison. Patty's expression grew grim. Because my father embezzled over $200,000 from their joint projects and disappeared. He left your husband holding massive debts and legal liabilities. Richard had to sell properties and take out loans to cover the missing money and complete contracted work. The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. James examined the documents carefully while I tried to process this revelation. Your husband rebuilt everything from scratch, Patty continued. But it took him years to recover from what my father did. That's why he was so careful about trust structures and asset protection. He knew how quickly partnerships could turn predatory. She pulled out a stack of photographs. These are pictures of properties my father was supposed to complete, but abandoned. Your husband finished them with his own money to protect his reputation and honor the contracts. I recognized some of the buildings. Richard had indeed worked on those projects, but he'd never explained why they took so much longer than expected, or why money was tight during those years. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Patty's eyes filled with tears. Because when my mother and brother decided to target you, I knew it wasn't random. They'd been planning it for months, studying your husband's obituary and property records. They knew about the partnership history. They knew Richard had rebuilt his wealth, despite what our father stole. She wiped her face with a tissue. They saw it as collecting on an old debt. They convinced themselves that your husband owed our family money because of the partnership losses, even though our father was the one who stole. James frowned. That's not how partnership law works. When one partner embezzles, the remaining partners are victims, not debtors. I know that. You know that. But my mother and brother created their own twisted logic to justify what they planned to do. They told themselves they were taking back money that should have been ours. I felt a strange mixture of anger and clarity. So this wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was planned revenge against a dead man who was actually a victim of your father's crimes. Yes, and I couldn't live with that knowledge anymore. I thought you deserved to understand why they seemed to know so much about your husband's business practices and why they were so confident about the asset amounts. Patty reached into her portfolio one more time and withdrew a small notebook bound in cracked leather. This was my father's journal from 1995, the year he disappeared. I found it in his belongings after he died 3 years ago. I think you should read the last entry. She opened to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. I've made terrible choices. Richard Marlowe trusted me, and I betrayed that trust by taking money from our joint accounts. I told myself it was borrowing, that I'd pay it back after the Atlantic City run. But the gambling took everything, and now there's no way to replace what I stole. Richard will have to cover the debts alone. He'll lose properties, maybe everything we built together. He's a good man who deserves better than a partner who steals from him. I'm leaving Charleston tonight. I can't face him. I can't face the families who trusted us to complete their homes. I'm a coward and a thief, and the best thing I can do now is disappear, so Richard can rebuild without my failures dragging him down. If anyone reads this someday, know that Richard Marlowe was an honest man who got destroyed by his partner's gambling addiction. Everything he achieved after 1995 came from his own work, his own integrity. He earned every dollar twice over. I closed the journal and sat back in my chair, finally understanding why Richard had been so protective, so insistent about trusts and safeguards. He'd learned the hard way that even good people could become dangerous when desperation took hold. Patty, why did you keep this journal? Why didn't you destroy it? Because I hoped someday I'd have the courage to give it to your husband and apologize on behalf of my family. But he died before I found that courage. When my mother and brother started their plan, I knew I had to act. James gathered the documents carefully. This explains the sophisticated knowledge they displayed about trust structures and asset protection strategies. They weren't just fishing for information. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Will this help with anything legally? I asked. It establishes premeditation and reveals the multi-generational nature of the fraud. The district attorney might reopen the case to pursue additional charges. But I wasn't thinking about additional prosecution. I was thinking about Richard working alone to rebuild everything after his partner's betrayal. The late nights, the careful budgeting, the gradual accumulation of properties that eventually became our financial security. He'd never told me about Robert Morrison's theft because he didn't want me to worry or lose faith in people. Instead, he'd quietly rebuilt our lives and created structures to prevent it from happening again. Patty, I have one more question. Do you know why your mother and brother thought I'd be an easy target? She nodded reluctantly. Because you lived modestly, despite having substantial assets. They researched your lifestyle and concluded you were either unaware of your wealth or too confused to protect it. They saw your simple house, an old car, as evidence of vulnerability. But those were choices, not limitations. I understand that now. But they interpreted frugality as weakness. They thought widows who lived quietly would sign quietly. As Patty gathered her documents to leave, she turned back one final time. Mrs. Marlowe, I know this doesn't change what my family did to you. But I wanted you to know that your husband was a hero in ways you might not have realized. He survived betrayal and built something beautiful anyway. The villas he left you weren't just properties. They were proof that integrity can overcome anything. After she left, James and I sat in contemplative silence. How do you feel about all this? He asked. Grateful, I replied. Grateful that Richard protected me, even from knowledge that might have made me bitter. Grateful that I fought back against people who saw me as an easy target. And grateful that even in criminal families, someone can choose to do the right thing. That evening, I called Lydia and told her everything. About her father's stolen partner, the planned revenge, the journal entries that revealed the true scope of Richard's character. Dad rebuilt our entire lives and never once complained about the betrayal, she said, her voice filled with wonder. He just quietly did the work and made sure we were secure. That's who your father was. He believed in building rather than blaming. 6 months later, I established the Richard Marlowe Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. Using income from the villa properties, the foundation provides free legal services to elderly fraud victims and funds educational programs about financial predators. The foundation's first major project was a workshop series called Fortress Building, Protecting Your Assets and Dignity. We've trained over 500 seniors in recognizing fraud schemes, establishing protective trusts, and fighting back against financial abuse. Frances Wellington, who recovered her farm through our legal victory, became the foundation's first volunteer coordinator. Dorothy Blackwell teaches workshops on recognizing emotional manipulation. All 7 of the Morrison victims have become advocates for other seniors facing similar attacks. Lydia finished her master's degree and now works as the foundation's education director. She's remarried to a man named David who teaches high school history and coaches baseball. Their relationship is built on transparency and mutual respect. Everything her first marriage wasn't. I learned that love without boundaries becomes enablement, she told me at David's graduation from law school, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to make their child's bad choices easier. Last month, I received a letter from Ethan in prison, 2 pages of apologies and explanations, trying to rebuild bridges that his actions had burned completely. I read it once, then filed it away without responding. Some relationships cannot be repaired, only grieved and released. But I also received a letter from a woman in Atlanta whose daughter was pressuring her to sign over property deeds. She'd read about my case in a magazine article and wanted advice. I keep thinking about your story, she wrote, about how silence can be armor instead of surrender. I'm not signing, and I wanted you to know that your courage is still protecting people you've never met. I framed that letter and hung it in my kitchen next to the photo of Richard in his checkered work shirt. This morning, like every morning for the past 2 years, I made tea and set out 2 cups. One for me, one for memory. The ritual anchors me, reminds me that even though I'm alone in this house, I'm not without presence or purpose. The roses Richard planted still bloom each spring, climbing the cedar trellis he built with lumber from a job site 40 years ago. Even after the worst storms, they return with a fragrance that reminds me of promises kept. If you're facing your own threshold right now, with someone pushing papers across your table and calling it love, remember this. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to ask for time. You are allowed to say, please contact my attorney. Dignity is not stubbornness. It's stewardship of the life you've built and the values you've earned. I love my daughter. I did not sign. I am still here. Those three truths live in the same room now, no longer competing, but complementing each other. The fortress Richard built protected more than assets. It protected my ability to remain myself while still being a mother, to draw boundaries that love could respect. Before I close, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Are you someone who needs to hear that fighting back is possible? Are you someone who's already fought and won? Are you someone still deciding where your own lines should be drawn? Your stories matter. Your courage matters. And sometimes, the most important victory is simply refusing to surrender what took a lifetime to build. The brass key now sits on my kitchen table, no longer hidden in my pocket. I touch it each morning before I turn on the porch light, a reminder that some doors only open from the inside, and that the person holding the key gets to decide who enters. Take care of yourselves. Keep your paperwork close and your boundaries closer. And remember, love without limits becomes theater, but love with healthy boundaries becomes legacy. I'll be here at my table with 2 cups of tea, the porch light burning, and the door held open only for respect. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for subscribing to this community of people who believe in quiet strength and loud justice. And thank you for proving that sometimes the most powerful thing an elderly woman can do is simply refuse to disappear.